Most cases have some kind of mystery to them: who did the killing, why they did the killing, and they almost always involve some kind of resistance from the victim. This case, however, is a little different to most cases. We know who did the killing. We even know why the killing happened. And shockingly, there was actually no resistance from the victims in this case. They'd been fed so many extravagant and complex lies that it really does seem that at the time of the murder, they really believed that this was the right thing to be happening. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes as a podcast or YouTube version in the description box down below. This one is going to make you so angry. In very basic terms, the case that I have for you today involves this family whose main belief system meant that they believed women could not be pure, whatever that means. And coincidentally, the entire family believed that the devil would one day take over the women's souls. The only person who would know when this had happened was God's messenger, who also happened to be the only son in the family. And the only way to save this woman's soul was to kill her. Now, just before we begin, a note on the source material for this. There is a lot of conflicting accounts, and so I'm going to tell you the story based on the information that I have found with the most corroboration. So this case kind of starts in December of 1970 at a house owned by Dr. Walter Trenkler. Dr. Walter was at home one evening when he heard a knock at his door. He did have a housemaid, Sabine Alexander, but although she would usually be the one who would answer the door, at that exact moment in time, she was busy in the kitchen cutting vegetables for the day's meals. So at this time, it was easier if he just opened the door himself. So Dr. Walter walked towards the door, pulled it open, and on the other side, he found two men. They introduced themselves as Sabine's family members. Harold was her father, and Frank was her brother, and they were asking to see Sabine straight away. Dr. Walter said of course they could, and he invited them inside. What struck him as odd, though, was that the two men in front of him were covered in what looked like mud, although this would later be confirmed to be blood. So, although he'd invited them inside, he didn't necessarily want to leave them alone in the house, and so he stayed close by as he called Sabine to come and join them. Sabine took a seat and she just looked up and listened to what the two men had to say. Quote, "Sabine dear, Frank and I have just killed your mother and your sisters." Dr. Walter was utterly speechless. Not only had the men delivered this news so matter-of-factly, as if they were telling Sabine what they'd had for their dinner that day, but also Sabine then took her father Harold's hand, she placed it against her cheek, and she calmly looked up at him and responded, quote, "I'm sure you did what you thought was necessary." Harold then turned to Dr. Walter and confirmed he knew the doctor had heard what they'd said. Of course, he'd been just a couple of feet away. He then told him, quote, "We've killed my wife and daughters. It was the hour of killing." Dr. Walter then ran into his office, he closed the door behind him, and he called the German consulate to report what he'd just been told. The police arrived at the house very quickly, and immediately they arrested Harold and Frank, and they took them down to the station. It was only then that the entire story about what happened that night came out, and this actually coincided with the authorities arriving at the Alexanders' house. And when they got there, they came across the most gruesome and chilling crime scene any of them had ever seen before. On first entering the house, the officers found pretty much everything that the family owned completely, well, just destroyed. Clothes and papers were shredded. Crockery and other household items were broken into various different pieces. Even the family's passports, including Harold's and Frank's, they were just ripped up and strewn about. And the actual rooms of the house were much worse. The walls were covered with blood spatter, and the floors had patches of pools of deep red blood staining. Now, to get to how and why this all happened, we have to go back to the start, which is all the way when Harold was a young boy in the 1930s. Whilst he was living in Hamburg, Germany, Harold met this man called George. Now, George was the leader of this society called the Lorber Society. It's a religious group that at this time had been around for about 100 years. The group was a community or society that was completely unaccepting of other people. Anyone that wasn't in their little group was deemed as evil. And their group was small. There was never more than 1,000 people. And there's not a huge amount of information, to be honest, about the Lorber Society in general. What we do know is that Harold and his wife Dagmar became members of this society sometime when they were quite young. And whilst they were a part of this community, Harold became extremely close to George, the Lorber Society leader, and everyone in the society believed that George, as the leader, could communicate, had a direct communication with Christ. Now, this newfound closeness between George and Harold seemed to coincide with George becoming quite unwell. As far as I can tell, there was nothing necessarily suspicious. He was just of old age. But in this, he was kind enough to offer George his services in nursing him in his final days. And sure enough, it wasn't long before George died. Now, after he had passed away, Harold said that he had an announcement to make. He said that George had appointed him leader of this Lorber Society. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that there wasn't really much known about this society in general, what happened inside of it, but it is of course possible that George never appointed Harold as the new leader and Harold had just made this up. Either way, Harold was now in charge and he took his new role extremely seriously. And one thing that came to him from Christ that he made sure everyone knew about was that in about 10 years' time, the Messiah, a certain messenger of God, would come to earth and everybody, not just the Lorber Society, but everybody would be forced to recognise him. And Harold made sure that everyone knew that when this happened, he would be able to tell them who the Messiah was. And so in 1954, he and Dagmar, his wife, had this baby who they called Frank. And of course, they announced that he was the Messiah, the messenger of God. The issue was, as you can imagine, Frank was told that he was this holy Messiah from the moment he was born. And this meant that he could do no wrong and no one could really question him. And he was just a kid. He couldn't be disciplined. He couldn't be even reasoned with. Whatever he said went. And as he grew into his early teenage years, what he wanted to explore was his sexuality, and his interest in girls became focused on his own mother and his three sisters, Marina, Petra and Sabine, who we met at the beginning of the story. Now, this way of life was obviously not acceptable to the wider community outside of the Lorber Society. And so, when Frank's behaviour with his sisters was discovered by his sisters' friends, the entire family was shunned. And they seemed to be confused as to why this was, why the incest was a problem. After all, as far as they were concerned, it had been God's will. Even so, after they were outcast from this wider community, the family decided to leave Germany altogether, hoping that a new life in a new country would be more accepting of their lifestyle. And this whole thing was actually propelled forward because Dagmar got quite a large inheritance from her family, and it meant that they could move and live in Tenerife quite comfortably. And this, in Tenerife, is kind of where we started the story with Dr. Walter and Sabine, where the two men, Frank and Harold, have come to the house. So we're back in the 1970s and this kind of revelation has happened. The police have turned up at this horrific house, this horrific scene where there are blood pools everywhere. And on further inspection, they discover bodies. They discovered the bodies of 18-year-old Marina and 15-year-old Petra, Frank's sisters and Harold's own daughters. Now, the bodies had been so badly damaged and mutilated that it was hard to identify them just from sight. Both the girls had their breasts cut off, they had their genitals deformed, and all of those kind of body parts were removed from their bodies, and then they had been nailed to a wall nearby. Frank's mother, Harold's own wife, Dagmar, she was the final body to be found, and she had been mutilated much in the same way as her two daughters, and body parts had been cut off and then also been nailed to a wall nearby. And finally, Her heart had been ripped out and it was dangled from a string. Now, not only was the evidence overwhelming, but both Harold and Frank were completely confused. They were upfront about what they'd done and they didn't see any problem with it really. Not only had they confessed to Dr. Walter, but they were at the police station being questioned and they were happy to admit exactly what they'd done. Frank told the interviewing officers that he had been at home just standing in the bedroom with his mother, Dagmar, and she came in closer and he said that she looked at him in a way that she wasn't, quote, permitted to do. And this, one thing, is what caused him to then take a hanger and hit her on the head with it. Now, at first when I read this, I was a little bit confused. I thought about how striking someone with a hanger probably wouldn't do much damage at all. But I then looked into what these clothes hangers were like in this time, and in this period, they definitely had potential to be much more heavy duty. It would be like a heavy wooden hanger with kind of steel hooks on it, and a more sturdy hanging part. So assumedly it was something that could have done quite a lot of damage. Anyway, so Frank had used that hanger to strike his own mother a number of times and she hadn't resisted. In fact, once she realised what was happening, what was about to happen, she just lay down on the bed and allowed it to happen. Now, Frank continued hitting Dagmar and he didn't stop until she fell off of the bed onto the floor and was very clearly unconscious. And Frank went on to tell officers that during this time, his father Harold had been in the living room and he was playing on the organ quite casually. Frank joined him and whilst he was in there, he turned to his sister Marina and he used that same hanger to start striking her a number of times over the head. And then he did the same with his other sister, Petra. It suggested that at some time Frank became quite weak from using this hanger. And so he went to get something that would cause significant damage a lot quicker and with a lot more ease. He left and he came back a few moments later with a hammer to finish these attacks with. The entire time, Harold, seeing what was happening to his own daughters, he just sat there and continued to play music on the organ. Occasionally, whilst he was playing, he would also praise Jesus. Now, this was until Frank began to mutilate the bodies. Quote, "When I started cutting away the offending parts, he came to help me." Harold admitted this was all true. And when I say admitted, I just mean that he really confirmed it all. He didn't seem to be ashamed or sorry that he was even caught. It would appear that both he and Frank believed that what they did was the right thing. Harold also said that the entire family had discussed it. They referred to it as the, quote, holy time, and that they always knew that it was going to happen. It was always just a matter of when. The women in this family had expected this hour of killing, as he later referred to it. He said it was required that the women would become sacrificed. In fact, they needed to sacrifice themselves for their prophet, and of course the prophet in this case was Frank. The police had a thorough and detailed confession from each of the two men. They also had ample evidence from the house, and so they were prepared to go to trial. Now, as I said at the beginning, there are a few conflicting sources. A couple of sources say that the case actually went to trial and that it went to trial for 2 years, with the death penalty very much being on the table. But other sources said that there was no trial at all. Either way, the outcome was the same. The pair were deemed not sane at the time of the crime, and so they were sent to the Penitentiary Psychiatric Assistance Centre located in Carabanchel Prison. Now, at the time, it was one of only 3 places in Spain that treated mentally ill patients, and so they were held up there. The father and son duo stayed at this facility for years until 1990. Now, the next part is reported in various sources, but there are some that it's completely missed out from. But there was an arrest warrant issued by Interpol in 1995. So as far as I can tell, this next final bit is the last kind of knowledge or piece of information that we have. In the early 1990s, Harold and Frank somehow managed to escape from this psychiatric treatment centre that they were in. Although the arrest warrant that was issued continues, it says that they've never been found and they are missing to this day. What is kind of chilling is that Sabine really believed what her father and brother had fed to her, and it was reported that after they were arrested and sent to this psychiatric treatment facility, she begged officials to let her go and stay with them as well. Now, of course, they wouldn't allow this. And so the last reported thing with her is that she committed herself to a convent. Since then, she's not been seen or heard from. However, some sources suggest that she actually went into hiding, and other sources suggest that Harold and Frank found her and completed their ritual by killing her and then killing themselves. But it seems that whatever really happened, no one knows, and this may remain a mystery forever. But I think what we do know from this case is that when ego and fantasy remain unchecked, it can lead to deadly consequences. And in this case, the thing we know for sure is that there were 3 women who lost their lives, 2 of them just teenagers. This case is not well known, it's not well covered, but I think what we have to do, if we can, is forget about the 2 men that were involved in this and remember the names of the 3 women who lost their lives: Dagmar, Petra, and Marina. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of REDRUM. Guys, I have to just say, I've been getting so many incredibly kind comments from you guys. I really, really appreciate every single one. I can't tell you how nice it is to just kind of chat with you all and read about what's been going on, what you're watching at the moment, what you're thinking of the case that I've just told. So I just wanted to say thanks. Other than that, today's recommendation is actually for you guys in the United States. I feel like you could do with some good news. I went to Chicago last week or the week before. My friend's out there. She's in a play called Pericles, which is on at Chicago Shakespeare Theatre. So definitely, that's not the recommendation, but go and check that out if you're over that way or if you're based in Chicago. I think it's on till like the beginning of December, so you've got a little while. And of course, if you go and see it, let me know what you think. But my recommendation for today is actually something that you can get all across the country. And forgive me if this is super well known. It's definitely a chain, but it's one that I hadn't heard of before. And when I went over to visit Chicago, I actually had to travel a little way out of where I was staying to go and find it, but it was well worth it. As you may know, I am absolutely obsessed with cookies. We do have cookie places here in the UK, but it's not the same as the US. We don't have the like thick New York style sort of melt in the middle deliciousness that you guys have. I actually became so obsessed with cookies that I started my own cookie company at the end of last year. Honestly, I've been working on getting the recipe right for the last 8 months before I launched only a couple of months ago now. I am hygiene rated, I have a website, it's really exciting. I've just got to stop eating all the cookies because I have to taste test, right? It's very important. But it's called Thicc Bakes if you're interested at all. I'll leave a link in the description box down below, maybe put some pictures in. But I'm just starting small and basically I'm stocking to a couple of cafes here in Notts. It's very limited, it's like postal orders and a few cafes here. But I'm really enjoying doing it and enjoying doing that alongside REDRUM. I just feel like the luckiest person in the world. It's very, very wholesome and lovely and enjoyable. But this actually isn't about Thicc Bakes. This is about the amazing cookies that I tried in Chicago. And I tried a lot. But I'd say of all the ones I tried Levain, I tried Crave, I tried, I can't remember, I'll find out what the other one was called. But the ones that I enjoyed the most were from Chip City. They have stores all over in Connecticut, Florida, Illinois, Maryland and New Jersey, and New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia. So literally like everywhere. Well, I know that's not everywhere, but a lot. I got 6. I honestly wanted more, but I'd been to all these other places. I had to tell myself to get a grip. Time my life, etc. So from Chip City, my favourite was the cookies and cream because it's kind of like a sugar cookie, but I really loved all of them, and the triple chocolate because I'm addicted to all things chocolate. Anyway guys, highly recommend. And if you're in the UK and you have a favourite cookie place, please let me know. I love going and trying and taste testing. It's business expense, etc, etc. Also, how cool is this jumper? I actually don't know where it's from. It might be Etsy. I'll find out and I'll link it down below. But yes, other than that is my final thing. Recommendation City this afternoon. All right, I'll see you soon. Bye.